recording.
Welcome to the roundtable on civil society advocacy in AI governance, lessons learned of the 2021 Data Justice Conference. My name is Corinne. I'm a PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I will be moderating the conversation today. Before introducing our excellent set of speakers, I will give a short introduction to the topic at hand. So what we've seen over the last 2-3 years is that civil society participation in developing both guardrails and regulation for AI governance is really crucial. And then a number of civil society organizations across the globe in the past years have questioned, for instance, the efficacy of voluntary ethics frameworks and also called on a ban to use biometric technologies. At the same time, what we've also seen is that civil society participation in these processes, especially when they're very heavily industry-led, is never without risks. It can lead to what is called ethics washing, and it can also obfuscate corporate capture of regulatory processes. And so this raises a number of really hard questions for whose worldviews are represented and who is overlooked in current civil society advocacy around AI governance. And discussions of civic participation in datafied societies, the topic of the conference this week, must also include critical consideration of recent civil society efforts in AI governance. And this roundtable will try to facilitate that specific conversation by bringing together a number of experts in the field to discuss lessons learned from researching and advancing AI governance and advocacy across the globe. And today we are very lucky to be joined by Vidushi Marda, who is a human rights lawyer and the lead on artificial intelligence at human rights NGO Article 19. By Fieke Jansen, who is a PhD candidate at the Data Justice Lab at the University of Cardiff. And by Frederieke Kaltheuner, who is a tech policy analyst and the manager of the recently established European AI Fund. And we will kick off with some short remarks from each of these speakers before discussing where their work and their findings overlap and diverge. And as such, I will first give the floor to Fieke.
Thank you, Corinne, and hi, Frederieke and Fieke. It's good to be here. So like Corinne said, as part of my work with Article 19 and also in the space in general, I've seen different layers of conversation around the question of AI governance. So you have a very high level conversation at, say at the UN or the ITU, where we talk about AI ethics principles, and you see the same kind of conversation shadowed in national contexts as well. But in the recent years, what I've been trying to do with my work is kind of center the human societal experiences of systems as a focal point of how we think about AI governance and how we come up with the needs and responsibilities that we need within AI governance. And I want to draw from 2 recent pieces of research to kind of show how we see civil society's role as crystallizing in the public eye, but also evolving as time goes on. So between 2018 and 2019, along with a PhD student at the Jawaharlal Nehru Institute in New Delhi, I did some ethnographic research on what Delhi's predictive policing system looked like. And it became very clear right at the outset that civil society was not welcome to be asking the questions that we were. And I think part of it could have been because we were very obviously human rights focused advocates who were looking into why certain AI systems were being used by law enforcement. But I think more generally, it's because the incentives for having technologies in societies, and by that I mean government incentives to kind of modernize our police force or corporate incentives to sell technologies, don't really align with civil society's overarching goal of thinking about societal consequences, thinking about vulnerable and marginalized populations. And so in that case, what we ended up doing was not necessarily looking at the actual impact of these systems on societies, but rather focusing on how institutions and actors gave these particular technologies a space in societies and how the use of these systems evolved within institutions. So I think the first point that I want to kind of really focus on is thinking about civil society's ability to meaningfully engage in the design, development, and deployment of technologies, and also being agile in how we study these technologies. So it's not always possible to study outcomes because either the data doesn't exist or you're not given access to documents that you need access to. But there is a lot to be said about how technologies come to exist in societies. And the second piece that I quickly want to talk about before giving the floor to my co-panelists is recent research on China's emotion recognition market. This is research that I did with Shazeda Ahmad, who's a visiting scholar at the AI Now Institute. And in this case, it was interesting because the strategic reason why we chose emotion recognition in China in 2020 is that we recognize from the facial recognition experience around the world that we needed to be ahead of the curve in a certain sense. We needed to kind of talk about technologies before they become ubiquitous, before their use is widespread around the world, to kind of critique the fundamental assumptions that lead to these technologies coming into societies, but also study the actors who are propelling the use of these technologies across the globe. And what we found there was that it's more important to look at the market forces of demand and supply that legitimize and develop technologies far more than it is, far more important or far more urgently than it was to study just the outcomes. And the reason for that is through our research, we found that the use of emotion recognition wasn't necessarily just about corporations and just about governments. There were a lot of academic interests, there were a lot of research interests that kind of legitimized problematic pseudoscientific foundations. And because of that, the demand and supply for these technologies kind of grew. And civil society's role is kind of an awkward fit there because we don't really have the same incentives as other actors, and we don't necessarily have the power or resources as other actors. And so the question becomes, what do we do? And I think the answer to that is, at least at this point in time, I think that the answer to that is broadly that we need to think ahead of the curve, but also keep a focus on the actors and the institutions that legitimize the use of AI systems, especially given the fact that we are fundamentally at a disadvantage in terms of power and resources. So I'll stop there and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these excellent thoughts, Vidushi. Then I would like to move on to Fieke.
Thanks, Corinne, and thanks, Vidushi, for the great points you already made. I'll also be talking about sort of my reflections on civil society role in sort of AI governance. And these are both from sort of the interviews with civil society that I've done as a part of my PhD, but also as a Mozilla Public Policy Fellow, where I engaged in the public consultation of the European Commission on the AI white paper or their strategy on AI. And I think sort of there's three key points I want to highlight. What we see when we have to sort of reflecting on civil society participations in these debates, and I think they sort of align with Vidushi's one, is sort of the first key question is, what is civil society participating in? So it's often a question, especially for instance, if we look at the public consultation and sort of all the advocacy and lobbying that has been happening around the AI white paper and the current leaked sort of AI regulation in Europe, is that it's often not a question about if, but how and under which conditions AI should be deployed. And what we're really seeing is a political rationale in Europe where the European Commission really wants to create an enabling market environment for European companies to compete sort of internationally against the Chinese and American companies, so that we don't lose the race of the new tech development. And so a lot of the strategy is actually directed at sort of creating an enabling environment, both in terms of sort of financing, so investment in artificial intelligence, but also in terms of regulation. So how can we regulate maybe the high risks or the unintended harms, but then still create an enabling environment? And so participating in this discussion on the European level, it's really about sort of participating in sort of mitigating the harms of an enabling environment. Because the question of, should we actually invest in this? Should we actually engage within AI, sort of AI, pushing AI by government? That question is already answered. And the question is, yes, we should invest in this. And so as a civil society, you're basically trying to make it less bad or trying to make the strategy less bad instead of sort of proposing a revolutionary alternative, for example, because that boat has sailed already. And then the second thing that I really sort of reflecting on this process is which voices are included in the conversation. So we often, when we look at sort of who's participating in these AI governance debates, if we look at civil society participations, they're traditionally sort of digital rights organizations, maybe now more traditional human rights organizations, but there's definitely a sort of part of civil society that's excluded, or sort of part of sort of civic sector that's excluded, like trade unions, for example, which have definitely something to say about sort of AI governance, but also the environmental sector is excluded. And this partly has to do with sort of the knowledge and skills that is required to engage in these conversations, because especially the high level conversations require quite a lot of sort of knowledge and skills, both on the topic, but also on the political processes. And sort of, it really creates barriers for participation. And that what we're also seeing is sort of like how these AI systems, especially when we see it in relation to law enforcement, for instance, but also other public services, is that they often target certain groups in society that are actually excluded from these conversations. So we had the entire Black Lives Matter protest around the world, but what we're seeing in Europe, for instance, is that the groups that are missing are, for instance, civil society groups that are advocating for Muslim rights or for Roma Sinti travelers. And these are often sort of the groups on which these optimizing technologies are sort of directed at. Especially when we talk about the context of law enforcement. And it's not only that they're excluded from the conversation, but especially what we see with the developments in France is, for instance, that Muslim rights organizations are also criminalized at the moment. So it's even an additional sort of hurdle to engage with this. And then the other thing is that we often use a rhetoric about human rights. And so we overlook other sort of issues such as social economic rights or environmental rights. So there's one entry point into sort of a lot of the discussions about the harms and mitigating the harms of AI. And then sort of the final point is that I don't think we understand the conflict enough between sort of the role that civil society plays. So here, for instance, it often is also civil society participation can create a legitimacy or a legitimizing effect where maybe there's not one civil society, there's different organizations and elements all fighting for very specific rights. And if you see, for instance, on a local level in Amsterdam, very often like the same groups are engaging in policy discussions that relate to, for instance, privacy by design or other things, whereas other groups might feel that they don't want to engage with these discussions because they fundamentally disagree with sort of the integration of AI within sort of city infrastructures. And here there's a conflicting role of civil society, where on the one hand, the participation of some legitimizes its use actually, and on the other hand, if groups choose not to engage with it, you can also not mitigate unintended consequences of the things that, for instance, people in the city haven't thought about. So I'll leave it at that.
That's great. That gives us quite a number of headaches and processes to connect into. And luckily, we also have someone who is thinking really hard about what it means to build up civil society in this particular space. And so I'm giving the floor to Frederieke.
Yes, thank you very much. So I would like to talk about two things. On the one hand, I would like to share a bit more the rationale and the strategy behind the European AI Fund. And also at the end, briefly mention the rationale and the reason for doing some of my own work that I've done in this area. So the European AI Fund was, the idea came up, I think in late 2019, early 2020. I was not involved in the discussion, where a number of foundations came together and realized that there is a lack of funding when it comes to supporting civil society on AI in Europe specifically. The fund wasn't supposed to launch as quickly as it did, and that's how I came on board. But there was a sense, I think in March last year, that the ongoing COVID pandemic has made some of the issues that the fund had identified more urgent than ever. So on the one hand, there are human rights violations that in the initial strategy scoping for the fund that were identified in relation to AI that are also extremely important in the context of pandemic. from biosurveillance, biometrics more broadly, uses around data, amongst other things, market concentration, power shifts. But at the same time, the analysis was also that it's kind of, we're living in really interesting, challenging times. And it's very likely that tech companies are going to emerge much stronger from this pandemic than anyone else. While at the same time, civil society organizations, and I realize this every day, including all of us here, continue to operate under incredibly challenging conditions, with schools being closed, open and closing, unpredictability, staff being sick. But I also think if you think about it, it's already difficult for civil society to influence policymaking on the European level, but right now there are no real meetings. So everything is more difficult, while at the same time, tech companies, or the very few companies that dominate the market, particularly around AI, are poised to emerge stronger than ever. So that was our analysis of the situation in summer last year. And as a result of this, we chose to launch the fund with 2 funding streams, and both of them say something about sort of our assessment of the need or the question of this panel. So the first one is, we did put aside a smaller grant to support research that monitors Europe's tech response to the pandemic. I feel really strongly about this because this is something that the shifts or the decisions that are being made now can create infrastructure that can last for generations. So this is something incredibly important. And we selected a group of organizations that cover a range of issues, from vaccination certificates to global power shifts, to reflecting on the contact tracing debate. So this is sort of one area. And also we had the impression, and there was a lot of monitoring work being done by organization on top of existing work plans, and that it's really important for the sector collectively that this work continues. And the second component is we launched an open call on 2 things, specifically strengthening the capacity of civil society organizations that already do advocacy around digital rights and AI specifically, and strengthening the policy capacity, because this is something that's not always covered in funding. And the second component is the fund also, and I'm really glad that Fieke mentioned this as well, wants to bring in new voices to the debate. On the one hand, organizations with domain expertise. A lot of debates around AI, they're very fluffy in the abstract, but it gets incredibly difficult when you talk about what does it actually mean for health, for employment, for credit, for fintech, etc. So organizations with domain expertise, but also organizations that either work with or represent marginalized communities, because as is always the case when it comes to digital rights, risks and harms are very unequally distributed. So this is the current assessment, but this is sort of, this is evolving. Those are just the first activities, and we're now at a stage where we're thinking what are further things we can and should do. So I'm really interested about the discussion that we are going to have. I really do think that we are at a crossroads in Europe. It can go either way. I am not convinced that there's a strong narrative for where Europe wants to be headed. There are lots of competing interests, and that makes it a particularly, combined with the pandemic, a really dangerous time to get sidetracked or even move towards a direction of harm. In my personal work on this issue, so I was a Mozilla Tech Policy Fellow last year, and only just now I'm about to wrap up the project. And the focus I've chosen is AI, pseudoscience, hype, and snake oil. Both Corinne and Fieke kindly wrote a piece for this collection. So it's an edited collection of essays, and I've chosen this focus of AI, snake oil, pseudoscience, and hype. And I think a lot of people are doing the same thing at the moment, to redirect the discussion away from how do we make AI more explainable, more transparent, less biased, towards what actually works, what doesn't work, and where are domains where we really shouldn't be using AI at all. So this is sort of, this is my contribution, but I also think it's a framing that's kind of necessary and useful in tech policy discussions more broadly, away from basically rejecting the premise that something is already going to happen. I like the German word Digitalisierung, which is like digital transformation. It always feels like it's something that is happening and society is reacting towards it, whereas in reality it's a conversation and we're also shaping it. And for this we also need to talk about what can the technology do at all, what can it not do, and what do we want it to do.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So I want to start off the first question sort of latching on to the concept or the idea of digitalisering as like a thing that we're all engaged in, because one of the things that I noticed across each of your talk is this this difficulty of the fact that you are all working in a situation where the accepted status quo is that AI is here, that it's here to stay, that for all intents and purposes, for many sectors, it's seen as a good thing, and that you are forced to sort of work around the edges of that truth. And I was wondering what kind of work, if any at all, you have seen civil society or researchers or anyone else do around really pushing back on that. Like, for instance, the work and the book that you are going to publish is doing to really say, like, can we take a step back and question whether this is the right way forward to begin with? So anyone who wants to pick up on that question, please go ahead.
I can pick up on it because you mentioned the book. It says in the introduction, we're at the downward end. We're at the downward slope of the hype cycle. And anyone, like, and all of us who've observed these debates for a while, terms and hypes come and go. A few years ago, we were talking about big data with the same kind of excitement. So basically, I think the challenge is collectively getting better at anticipating and engaging with these hypes and not getting caught up in it. And I don't think collectively and individually we've sort of mastered this, but I'm basically, what it requires is just patience. This is going to go away and then there will be the next hype, is my impression.
I agree. I think, you know, in 2015, when big data was the big thing, I remember writing a lot of grant proposals in a hurry and talking about big data. And then 3 years later, we were like, oh, it's the same thing, but it's got a new name now. So I definitely agree with Frederieke about hype cycles. I think one of the things that we need to start doing to effectively push back against this inevitability framing of AI systems in general, that I've actually seen be quite effective, is, and this is slightly legalistic, but I think it's effective. It's that we have to assume and we have to start with the premise that a lot of these technologies, especially when it comes to facial recognition, emotion recognition, predictive policing, they're all potentially rights infringing technologies. And if they are rights infringing, there's enough, enough standards in the law to say you can have rights infringing technologies as long as they comply with the standards of necessity, proportionality, legality, depending on where you are in the world, but also under international human rights law. And so I think ideally, we would have to come to a situation in which the use of AI systems or the deployment of AI systems doesn't just happen. It has to be justified at the stages of design and development before it's deployed. And I think flipping the script requires us to engage more mindfully with the actors who are pushing for design and development and pushing to keep civil society out of the room. Because often I find that we only find out about certain technologies after some harm has been done, right? Or once a news clipping has made its way through Twitter, or once we see people actually being affected by it. And the truth of the matter is, as much as I hate to say it, we're coming to the table too late. So if we have to effectively work against inevitability, I think we have to like push back and kind of look at the life cycle of how these systems are marketed, how they're developed, how they're funded, how they're procured, before we just think about outcomes.
Great. Thanks, Vidushi and Frederieke. I think what I've seen in, for instance, Europe, there's been some interesting litigation cases. So the Netherlands has been sort of one of the ground terrains for sort of contestation against the use of certain government services. And what we're seeing that despite sort of certain wins or that certain concerns in sort of the fraud detection algorithms, for example, used by the Dutch tax office, have led to sort of parliamentary debate, actually very little happened afterwards. So even though it was pushed all the way up to sort of the highest sort of level through courts or through sort of advocacy and all sorts of efforts, very little happened afterwards. But I think the positive sort of unintended consequences of all these litigation efforts and sort of all these advocacy efforts is not necessarily specific on the one system, but what I've seen with talking to police is that they're very afraid to becoming the next scandal. Because for public authorities, scandals is something very negative, and they are very aware of it. So while talking to police, while deploying risk scoring algorithms, for example, several have highlighted that, saying we don't want to become the next Siri, which was a court case against the use of fraud detection algorithm. So I think these are the unintended consequences that we don't see because we're not engaged in conversations with people in police or with social welfare or with people who are at the tax office deploying these systems. But I thought that was quite an interesting sort of observation, because maybe Siri is no longer deployed, but other risk scoring fraud detection algorithms are deployed, but people have become more hesitant. And I think sort of the Antifa always has this slogan where they say, shame racists back into hiding. Maybe we should also shame algorithms back into hiding so that people are less sort of excited about the use and the deployment. So I think that's one. And I don't think it's on a specific system, but a general sort of like idea about using these services for effectiveness and efficiency within public institutions. And then the other thing I agree with Vidushi is like civil society is coming at the table too late, once all the decisions have already been made, and it's like sort of the final idea about how we're deploying it, but not only about deployment, also about regulation. And here I do think that one thing I'm not seeing, for instance, in the European context, is that civil society is actually not challenging the investments that are happening in all this technology. So all of these technologies are, not all of them, but a lot of them are invested in with public funding, public research funding. So we see it in Horizon 20 or Horizon Europe, for instance, at the European level, but also at a national level. They're developing all these old technologies, facial recognition, voice identification, emotion detection. A lot of this is developed by public funding. And when it comes on the market or actually is being deployed, it's 5 years down the line. And a lot of the decisions have been made already. So I think what we're not good at is trying to influence those sort of funding streams.
That's an excellent point, and that also sort of ties together some of the different things that I've heard you say, like Vidushi mentioned, civil society comes to the table too late. And in your research, Vidushi, you also very specifically identify the question of the need to push back on both the economic and the political incentives at the front end of the process, right? And Fieke gives some examples of how that can be done, for instance, by focusing on these funding models. But I was wondering what other options all three of you see in terms of making sure that civil society work is not just about documenting outcomes, but about really pushing back on the dynamics on the front end of the process.
I've been recently looking just to understand procurement processes more. Just because, I mean, if you take something like smart cities, right, the assumption that we operate with, or at least I operated with up until last year or whatever, is that these policy initiatives come to exist because governments are looking for efficiency, they're looking for scale, they want to modernize, right? And then I started thinking about the push and pull, like how do these systems, like I'm pretty sure that no government official in the revenue department in New Delhi, for instance, is sitting and thinking about like facial recognition cameras to make fines more effective, right? So what does the pipeline of that process look like? Who is marketing the technology, or who is asking for the technology, and how is it built? But also, what are the roadblocks or what are the safeguards that you have in terms of procurement, right? So where does this assumption of technology being efficient come from? Or where does this assumption of facial recognition being legal come from? And it's actually fascinating because a lot of it just comes out of thin air really, in procurement documents. I'm finding that, I mean, I've been poring over all sorts of procurement documents, for instance, within India, and I'm finding that a lot of the assumptions about technology being efficient, technology being legal, they actually just come out of a random meeting where a random official has spoken to another random person from a company, and they've just decided that that's ground truth. And I think kind of questioning the assumptions on which a lot of this money is spent and a lot of time is spent by the people who are propelling these technologies is one thing that I'm trying to test out as an effective way of looking at it. I think this has been effective in the Chinese context, for instance, especially when we're thinking about facial recognition in Xinjiang. And so I'm hoping that that is something that is kind of helpful in the long run. But I'm looking forward to hearing from Fieke and Frederieke as well.
I have some thoughts that complicate the idea that civil society is too late or has to be early. I remember at Privacy International 3 years ago, I think, we were wondering whether it is too late to talk about smart cities. Because the smart city debate, it's like it's a term similar to big data and AI. It's elusive, nobody knows what it means. It's often used as a pretext for something else, for securitization of cities. And then a colleague did do work on this. And I got an email yesterday that Germany is launching its smart city strategy in 2021. So there are sometimes topics, and I think another one from more of a privacy perspective is encryption. There are just things that keep on coming back, and sometimes civil society is too tired to again have the debate about why do we need encryption, like because we've had these debates for so many times, and then something happens, someone opens a drawer with a ready proposal, and then boop, a new thing exists. So that was the one thing I wanted to throw in. And the other one is, I spent a lot of time in Germany in the past year, and it's been an interesting reverse culture shock in the sense that the debate is so different from the English language debate. And for me, the main difference is that there was also a report last week that German public administration is ridiculously analog, which is a problem in and of itself. It's like you need to buy a printer when you move back to Germany because everything needs to be printed. There is no online. There is no the equivalent of the UK like gov.uk. And I think this is also something that civil society organizations have been fighting for like good, inclusive, digital public services, for open data. And sometimes these debates are being conflated. So a lot of times this sort of the conversations that we are having are too ahead or too cutting edge and are really scary for people in the public sector who are just really worried about sending emails. This is sort of the level we're at. And I think that's a theme across different parts of Europe. So you cannot get like and this leads to also new injustices in crime, like the public unemployment offices in Germany don't just send an email. It's done via letter. And that means sort of if you're more mobile, if you don't have an address, it causes problems. And I'm finding this really challenging to translate this more English language debate, or having lived in the Netherlands, like these more digital societies, into a context where there are also real challenges with embracing the good sides of technology.
Yeah, I think maybe Frederieke, you pointed to a point where I think it's all like part of the thing is about contextualizing. So it's also about what does the debate mean in a specific context, but also the other way around. Where, for instance, I was working at a space when somebody from the city called up the person I'm sharing an office with about this crowd management system they have, where they look if people keep 1.5 meters distance. And they were asking if there were any problems open sourcing this technology so that people in other countries could also use it, because they got the request from 2 countries, I won't name the names, but one is a repressive dictatorship and the other one had just had crackdowns on protest, and if there were any problems with this. So it's not only about contextualizing the privacy debate, maybe because it means different things sort of in different countries. Having lived in Germany, I realized you need a fax machine, which is totally like strange in the Netherlands, for example. But also this idea, I think that we have to, it's sort of part is education, like educating the people who are deploying and these technologies, but also thinking through what it means to deploy these technologies in public authorities, what it actually, which worldviews they're privileging and how they can't see that it's contextual. So that's something that maybe is okay in the Netherlands, but it's still contested, so it's not okay. Might not be okay if you deploy it in a third country. And this is something that is totally not on the minds of people, because they look at technology as something, as an isolated incident, and not as sort of the how it furthers certain values, certain worldviews, and what it means if you take it from one context and use it in another, for example. And I think it's also about trying more fundamental concerns. One of the things I saw in my interviews is that people feel it's not only AI is hyped, but the privacy debate and the digital rights arguments are also hyped over other arguments that are maybe more fundamental, more hairy, more difficult to articulate. And so what we see as well is that when sort of oversight bodies or when when judges rule on sort of the legitimacy of a specific tool, is that they often do it on data protection aspects and not on discriminatory aspects, because it's so much more difficult to say something about this. And so one of the oversight committees in my interviews actually said, like, oh, there were so many issues with this facial recognition deployment in Belgium, but we just put forward this one because it was the easiest one, and so we stopped the discussion. And so it was halted on the basis of one element, but there were a lot of other elements around this. And I do think that also civil society, there's a tendency to go for the more clear-cut arguments, but these are often also the easiest to sort of optimize for due to procedural safeguards or by building privacy by design technology, or easier to safeguard against than sort of more fundamental, for instance, discrimination complaints.
That makes a lot of sense, and is also a really worrying development, because, like you said, that means that some of the most hairy, wicked problems don't necessarily get prefaced neither in the legal process nor necessarily by civil society uptake. And I was wondering what all three of you, but Frederieke in particular, given that the fund has so specifically focused on bringing the kind of organizations that represent issues around racism and around environmentalism to the front, what kind of a difference you think they can make, and how you expect, or how all three of you expect them to be most effective in trying to do that, when there is not only a technical pushback on that, but also a legal one.
The most important thing is this is a two-way conversation. So there are, I'm following with great interest the initiative by Adri and DF, the Digital Freedom Fund on decolonizing digital rights. That's a long overdue initiative, and yeah, it's really important. There is a complete lack of diversity within digital rights and European institutions, and Europe has a lot to catch up on when it comes to reflecting about history and racism more broadly. So I think this is the context in which all of these debates are happening. I would no longer attend these events, but in the past few years, I was often shocked to find myself at conversations about discrimination with nobody who's actually mostly affected by discrimination present. This is just, the fact that this is still happening is quite shocking. So that is the context. And so it is a two-way conversation in the sense that on the one hand, there is a need for digital rights organizations to engage more with communities who are disproportionately affected, but not just engage, but also really learn in terms of even problem framing. And you can see, for instance, in the US, debates around banning face recognition were driven by anti-racism organizations, and that's a completely different debate than talking about the really abstract technical data protection concerns that I strongly believe in, but they're also really difficult to sell to the public. It's much stronger from an advocacy point of view to say, like, I am being discriminated against and we don't want these systems. So that's one. But the other way around is also, yeah, I think the challenge of working in this area is that this topic has become like gender mainstreaming. There's a digital rights mainstreaming happening. You cannot work on anything without it being, like, any policy issue is closely entangled with questions around data governance, the power of tech companies, uses of technology by governments. Everything is tech policy now, which means that whatever your organization you are in, it was really difficult, we now have a random selection, but this is by no means complete, whether it's health, whether it's the environment, whether it's workers' right, there is now a tech policy component. So I think it's really, really necessary. And also I think will be beneficial for the entire debate to join forces and exchange, but it has to be a two-way conversation. So it's not digital rights organizations teaching environment organization how tech works, but both ways.
I have a question, but that'll involve a questionception, almost like a question within Corinne's question, which is, I think both Fieke and Frederieke said something that really struck a chord, which was that, you know, while we think data protection is important, while we understand the issues of emerging technologies, so, you know, quote unquote, or datafied societies in general to be important, our advocacy efforts aren't always effective because these issues keep coming back, right? And so the question for me, or the question that I want to pose to the three of you is, how can civil society be better at that? Right? Because like, I mean, my life's mission is to make my 15-year-old niece care about her data, but you know, it hasn't happened yet because we live on this hill that is driven by consumerism, in a sense, where personalization is something everyone wants, where convenience is something that's far more tangible than protecting your data because of some obscure reason that your aunt tells you to care about, right? So in that sense, I guess the question is, we can work within communities who are already clued into the debate, right? As Frederieke said, we can work between experts on digital technologies and experts from other realms, and that's important. But how do we take it outside that room? Like, how can civil society do the work of mainstreaming our more obscure issues better? Is it repetition? Is it reimagining what we do? Is it questioning the status quo? I don't know. It's a bit of an impossible question, but I'm looking forward to hearing what you'll think.
I think the underlying assumption here is that civil society is not effective. And of course, we can have a large debate about this, or not as effective as they want to be, because in the end, of course, there's so much power inequality and resources, and there are a lot of issues sort of, or barriers of being effective. I think one of the, like, I don't know how the rest feels about it, but I feel one of the issues I've encountered in working as a practitioner is that it's like all of the things sort of we're advocating for are symptoms of sort of a larger belief in progress, in sort of technology, that just keeps on being repeated and dominated. So you keep on fighting like same sort of narratives, but also everywhere we look, from our TV programs to sort of like how kids are now learning in schools because of the lockdown, everything sort of speaks to this belief of a tech utopia society where technology will offer us progress. So I think it's like shifting that narrative, like shifting the underlying rationale is super difficult. And I don't know if it's like, if that means engaging more in educational discussions, engaging with other groups, probably all of the above. But then, of course, it becomes a question of timing and resources. For instance, one of the things that I found super concerning in the lockdown here is when the primary schools went online, because the teaching in the Netherlands continued and everything went online, and parents became teachers, is that every primary school uses Google Classroom. And there was no thinking about it, but there was also no sort of guidance from the city, guidance from sort of the Ministry of Education about what would be the pros and cons of choosing Google Classroom. There was a crisis, it was there, everybody's using it now. And the only ones who are not using it is basically because they have an individual parent who is tech savvy and sort of privacy aware. So I feel like there's so many different fights to fight, from sort of high level AI policy debates to sort of really reality where nobody's actually offering any alternatives for a larger scale.
Again, to bring in my exasperation with Germany, I listened to a podcast yesterday which mentioned only 25% of schools do video teaching. The others just send workbooks for reasons, and the fear is data protection, that no video system is data protection compliant, which is also sort of like, that's a bit at the other end of the spectrum. I have very strong opinionated views on your question, Vidushi, but this is just me. I'm not speaking for the fund. This is me as sort of someone who feels very strongly about privacy. And for me, it's a very, very fine line between, on the one hand, of course, there's a need in education, but not data literacy, not this discourse or not tech, but just like general tech literacy, and especially among not just the general public, but politicians, regulators. The level of understanding is shockingly low. And I find this most shocking in debates around things such as advertising, which you can just Google. You can just try to run an ad on Facebook and then you understand how the targeting works. But that's a huge regulatory question where very few people seem to know how this actually works. But at the same time, there are also parts of this debate where I feel, where I'm always, I keep on coming back to what I think it was Max Schrems who said, who compared digital rights and data protection to things like food safety, consumer protection issues. If I go to a restaurant, I don't test in Europe. I don't like test my food. There are systems in place that I can trust that the food is safe. And there are aspects of this debate which are so technical and so advanced, which makes me think that I'm surrounded by things in my life. I don't know about nuclear power plant regulation. There's still a societal debate around whether or not nuclear power is good or bad, but the intricacies of the technical regulation, I feel like we're in the middle of an economic, people have things to do. I don't think it should be our full-time job to look after our data, because it places the burden again on the weakest link. But that's the fine line. So there is like an utter lack of awareness, but at the same time, there are also parts of this debate which are very technocratic, and it sounds undemocratic, but it also sort of, and maybe to end on this, like something that I've been in many of these citizen jury discussions or public consultations, and I'm sure that there are good ways to do this, but these can also quickly end up being incredibly problematic. So when you just ask people, so how should police use AI in policing? You need to know a lot about current AI discussions around fairness, explainability, etc., to even form an opinion about this. Which sounds so sort of course people should have an opinion about it, but there's so much education needed before we can even have this discussion. And if we skip this part, it's really easy to be manipulative. And I just was in one that I found manipulative, which was, the premise was we're using AI. But it's like, but the real question is, how can we do policing better? And like, but technology was automatically part of the equation.
Yeah, no, I love a good question in a question, and taking off my moderator hat for a moment. I think I see things very similarly to Frederieke and to Fieke in a way that, of course, technology education is really important. And being an auntie myself, I also see the point of trying to get through to the 14 and 16-year-olds how certain behaviors might have ramifications online, right? Not even discourage it, but just get a sense of, if you put something online, it is online and it will be there for a while. But I agree with the question of, making the individual responsible, especially when we know for whom that is most likely to be accessible and for whom it's not, right? It's the same thing that we see with privacy preserving devices and the kind of brands that make them tend to be really expensive, and hence that makes privacy right that is accessible for people who can afford products. And that's not the way to go. It's like Frederieke said, so you know that you can go to a restaurant and not leave with food poisoning and not need to bring your own little test tubes or figure out, how hot you need to cook an egg before it's safe. So we have a couple of more minutes, and if I can just sort of round up the incredibly rich conversation that we've just had, I think civil society working on these issues is definitely in a good space, both in terms of their thinking and the kind of support that they're receiving. There is a real need to stay ahead of the curve, but also be aware of the fact that many of these debates are sort of phantom debates that come up again and again in different forms. That there is a real need to bring in underrepresented but incredibly important sectors and individuals to really address the hairy and the more complicated topics, as well as contextualize AI and understand how it operates in different situations, and how in many ways sort of the moral nature of this technology is influenced by the way in which it is used and where it's used. And also be really aware of the role of the political actors that cement AI as a thing we should be wanting to begin with, and that is also a very valid battleground for civil society to push back on, to really ask, like, is this what we want, step one? And then if yes, how can we do this in a way that's human rights respecting and thinking about all of the different impacts that it has. And so the question that I would like to end on is, what do all three of you see as the next big battlegrounds for civil society?
You know, you've asked a good question. It takes more than 10
Might be
seconds to come back. Can you hear me? I suddenly can't see you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think just keeping in mind a lot of the research and a lot of the understandings that are being cemented within civil society as learnings, whether it's, you know, corporations are problematic when they talk about diversity and fire their staff, or, you know, predictive policing needs to be studied in a certain way, or facial recognition is racist by its very definition. I think a lot of our challenges are going to be structural. I think there's going to be a move away from just purely outcome-based research and more focus on trying to figure out how to change incumbent systems and power structures. And that's a very high-level kind of answer to your very good question, Corinne, but I think it's an important one across contexts, which is why I would invite reflection on it.
Yeah, I also think that maybe the next sort of battleground, I think they're all sort of more systemic in nature, and then there's like individual topics that sort of symptoms that allow these infrastructures to manifest. So I also agree. I think sort of like, I think with smart cities, there's going to be a battle about sort of how are we using city infrastructure to spy on people. Whereas sort of like it's very normal now in COVID that we talk about sewage surveillance in the Netherlands, and that how it's now going to be applied to all these other things, to monitor illness, to monitor all these things, drug use, you name it. I think in the context of COVID, people are like, yeah, whatever. I think this will be one of the things, because it can trigger an imaginary about sort of the state looking through your poo and your pee. That might not be desirable. So I think in the context of smart cities, there will be some conflicts. I'm sure there will be something with companies, but I'm looking less at it. I think there will be many conflicts within public institutions using it. I think we've only seen the starting point of sort of challenges to how technology is currently being applied.
For me, the frontier question is a lot of the debates were still, I love the sewage example. This is a really different one, but a lot of debates are still about things that are happening within the confinements of the screen, from polarization, personalized spaces, to surveillance, essentially, or the power dynamics, the power of platform power. We're talking about things that happen in the pixel universe, so to say, while at the same time we are seeing that the infrastructure is being built for these things to become much more ubiquitous, and we're going to have the same kind of problems and discussions. My answer is still going to be a boring one, because we still haven't solved the boring problems. Regulating ad tech is incredibly unsexy and boring, but I strongly believe it's one of the really most, that's the business model that we're talking about, and it's under-regulated. And the same comes to sort of like enforcing data protection laws. Many countries don't have data protection laws, or they're not really enforced up to sort of market dominance and making antitrust and competition laws fit for purpose for the new reality that we find ourselves in. I think this is one aspect. Sorry, I wanted to say something else. What was it? It's gone. I forgot.
I think this is already a really comprehensive set of challenges. that we have ahead of us. I want to thank all of you for being so incredibly concise. Did you want to hop back in, Frederieke?
I did remember. I think there are also
Bring it on.
fault lines. Sorry. There are also fault lines within civil society opening up. For example, around very legitimate concerns around hate speech and harassment versus a long tradition around freedom of expression, on the other hand. And there are more, also, I think the more mainstream digital rights becomes, the more we as Fieke said, there is no civil society, never has been, but the bigger the digital rights fields becomes, the more there will be themes and positions that we always took for granted that will look quite different, or there will be disagreements, and I think that's also fine.
Ending on the note of how it's not just the technology that we need to see within context, but also the development of civil society within context is I think a perfect way to end this roundtable. This will all be uploaded online. There will be ways to engage with the different speakers. So if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. And thank you for taking the time. You can hit the button.